11:47 that Tuesday night, my husband's phone lit up with a message that wasn't meant for me. The preview stayed visible for 4 seconds. Kirsten says the revised version is clean. She just needs your sign-off by Thursday. Don't use work email. Daniel was in the shower. I read it twice. Then I set the phone back exactly where it was, face down on the nightstand, and I went to bed. Most people would have confronted him immediately, but I'd spent enough years watching my mother manage information to understand one thing clearly. The person who asks first loses the frame, so I waited. And while I waited, I started paying attention to things I'd been trained not to notice. My name is Claire Reeves. 31. My husband is Daniel. 34. He works in regulatory compliance at a mid-sized financial services firm, the kind of job that sounds dull enough at dinner parties that no one ever asks a follow-up question. Disclosure filings, regulatory thresholds, audit documentation. I believed it was as boring as he made it sound. For 4 years, I believed that. But here's what I should have noticed earlier. When I asked Daniel what he actually did all day, his answers were always procedurally accurate and empty. Reviewed a reporting submission. Flagged a disclosure window. Closed out an audit trail. The language of someone who understood exactly how much a sentence can sound like information without containing any. I thought that was just how compliance people talked. I was wrong about that. The first thing I remembered after I read that text was something from 6 weeks earlier. I was at my mother's kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, watching Daniel sort through a stack of papers she'd handed him. This wasn't unusual. My mother, Kirsten, had used Daniel as an informal sounding board for years. She ran a small property management company. He knew regulatory filing requirements. The arrangement made sense on the surface. What I remembered, sitting in the dark at midnight with his phone face down on the nightstand, was the way he'd held those papers. Not reading them, just holding them, and the way he'd said it when he handed them back. These are fine. Just make sure the dates on the attachments match the submission window. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I thought about it differently. Match the submission window, not correct. Match. I want to be precise about what I knew and didn't know at that point. I did not know what Kirsten had asked him to revise. I did not know what file they were discussing in that text. I did not know that the word sign-off carried professional consequences for him, not just was a favor between family members. What I knew was this. The message said, "Don't use work email." And Daniel's company had a compliance documentation policy I'd heard him describe once, offhandedly, over dinner. Everything goes through the system. That's the whole point. The audit trail has to be unbroken. An unbroken audit trail, and a text message telling him to keep this one off it. I didn't sleep. The next morning, he left for work at his usual time, 7:42, the same as always, and I went to the filing cabinet in his home office. I want to be clear. I wasn't searching for evidence. I was looking for the folder I'd seen him bring home 3 weeks earlier, the one I'd noticed because Daniel never brought physical documents home. He told me that himself once, specifically. We're fully paperless now, compliance mandate. But 3 weeks ago, he'd come in with a manila folder tucked under his arm and set it on the kitchen table while he poured himself a glass of water. I'd been at the counter. I saw the label on the tab. I hadn't thought about it until now. The label said, KCM Holdings, Rev. 3, October 14th, I found the folder in the second drawer. It was still there. I sat down at his desk and opened it. Inside were 11 pages. The first 8 were what looked like a standard regulatory disclosure form, dense, formatted, nothing I could immediately parse. But the last 3 pages were different. They were printouts of what appeared to be the same form, but with different figures in several fields. Field 7, gross annual revenue from managed properties. Field 12, Number of actively managed units as of the filing date. Field 14. Outstanding liabilities as of the filing date. In the first version, the numbers were one thing. In the third revision, they were something else. I'm not an accountant, but I could see that the figures in revision 3 were lower, in some cases significantly lower, than what appeared in the earlier draft. And at the bottom of each page, in small print, was a line I almost missed. Prepared by D. Reeves Compliance Review, his name, on a document for his mother-in-law's company. A document that appeared to exist in at least 3 versions, each with different numbers. And none of them appeared to have been filed through his employer's system, because if they had, he wouldn't have brought the physical copies home. I sat there for a long time. Then I did something carefully. I photographed every page with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, and I went to work. On my lunch break, I searched the state licensing database for KCM Holdings. It took me 11 minutes to find the most recent annual disclosure filing. The gross revenue figure listed matched Revision 3, not the earlier draft. Revision 3, the lower number, was the one submitted. I stared at that number on my phone screen for a long time. I didn't yet understand why the numbers changed, only that they had, but I understood one thing clearly. Daniel had prepared multiple versions of a financial disclosure for Kirsten's company. Only one version was filed, and the field version was the one with the smaller numbers. I needed to understand what changing those numbers actually meant, what it affected, what it concealed, and whether what Daniel had done had a name. Because Compliance Review was the label on the folder. And compliance, I was beginning to understand, cuts both ways. It describes the people who enforce the rules, and the people who know exactly how to work around them. Before I tell you what I found when I looked at the metadata on those document scans, and why the timestamp on Revision 3 didn't match the date Daniel said he'd last helped her with paperwork, I want to ask you something. If you found 3 versions of the same document in your spouse's files, with the numbers getting smaller each time, what would you do first? Tell me in the comments. Because in part 2, I found something inside those files that Daniel almost certainly didn't know I could read. And it told me exactly when this started, and why Daniel had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure Revision 3 looked older than it was. The first real mistake Daniel made was one he probably never thought anyone would notice. Most people don't think about document metadata. When you create a file, a Word document, a PDF, a spreadsheet, the software quietly records certain things in the background. Things you never see unless you go looking. Created date, modified date, last saved by the author. Daniel knew this. He worked in compliance. Audit trails was his professional vocabulary, and buried in one of those pages was something he should have known better than to leave behind. The photographs I'd taken of the folder pages were just images. Flat, unreadable to any system, but one of the pages was slightly different from the others. The third revision, the field version, had been photocopied, not printed. The original must have been a digital file. And when Daniel printed it, then photocopied the printout, one thing survived that he likely didn't account for: the document's internal footer. Standard formatting, small type, easy to miss. In the bottom margin, almost at the edge of the page, it read, KCM Disclosure FY Annual V3 Final. DocX last modified. September 2nd, September 2nd. I stopped. Because 6 weeks earlier, at my mother's kitchen table, when I'd watched Daniel hand those papers back to Kirsten, he'd told me afterward, casually, walking to the car, that he'd helped her sort out a filing issue. Just some dates that needed aligning took about 20 minutes in July. July. The document said September 2nd. A document labeled final, the one submitted to the state, had been last modified 5 weeks after Daniel told me he was done with it. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went back to the database. The state licensing portal for property management companies in Illinois is not sophisticated, but it timestamps submissions automatically, day, hour, minute, and it keeps that record publicly visible. KCM Holdings' annual disclosure had been submitted on September 9th at 2:14 p.m., 7 days after the document was last modified. That part made sense. You finalize, then you file. What didn't make sense was the submission portal's second timestamp, the one I almost scrolled past. Document upload. Original file created July 18th. July 18th. The portal thought the file was created in July, but the footer said it was last modified in September. The dates arranged themselves into an order no normal document should have been able to produce. The portal recorded the file as created on July 18th, but the document's own footer showed it was last modified on September 2nd. A file modified 2 months after it was supposedly created is ordinary, but this ran the other direction. The footer date was later than the creation date, which meant either the footer was accurate and the creation date had been manually set backward, or the file had been rebuilt entirely. Same name, same structure, different content, and re-uploaded to the portal as though it were the original July document. Both explanations required someone who understood exactly how filing systems logged document provenance. Someone like Daniel. I wrote the dates in my notebook in a column. July, Daniel said he finished helping her. July 18, creation date logged by state portal. September 2, last modified date in document footer. September 9, submission date. 3 of those 4 dates told one story. One of them, the one Daniel gave me out loud, walking to my mother's car, told a different one. I need to tell you what KCM Holdings actually was because it matters for what comes next. Kirsten had started the company 11 years ago. Small residential properties, 6 buildings, maybe 40 units altogether. The kind of operation that stays under most regulatory radar because the revenue numbers are modest and the filings are routine, except that property management companies in Illinois are required to file annual disclosures with the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, the IDFPR, and those disclosures govern things like licensing eligibility, bond requirements, and whether the company qualifies for a specific tier of regulatory oversight. The tier matters. Tier 1 companies, those reporting above a certain revenue threshold, are subject to annual audits, site inspections, random financial reviews. Tier 2 companies below the threshold file and are largely left alone. The difference between the 2 figures I'd photographed, Revision 1 and Revision 3, was not subtle. In Revision 1, Field 7 showed gross annual revenue of $312,000. In Revision 3, the filed version, it showed $187,000, a difference of $125,000. I didn't yet know whether $187,000 kept KCM Holdings below the Tier 1 audit threshold, but I knew how to find out. It took me 40 minutes and 3 different regulatory documents to locate the current IDFPR threshold table. Tier 1 oversight, companies reporting gross annual revenue above $200,000. I sat back in my chair. $312,000 would have triggered mandatory annual audits. $187,000 kept Kirsten below the line. That was why the numbers changed. Not a filing error, not a rounding adjustment. A deliberate step under a line that would have brought inspectors to her door. And Daniel, who reviewed disclosure submissions professionally, who understood exactly where regulatory thresholds sat and what crossing them triggered, had prepared the version that kept her below it. 3 revisions. His name is on every page, and a creation date that someone had made sure looked like it came from July. I closed my laptop. Outside, the light had gone flat the way it does in late afternoon in October, and I realized I'd been sitting at the kitchen table for almost 3 hours. I thought about how Daniel had described his work to me over 4 years, the language he used, the careful emptiness of it. I make sure the filings are accurate. Accurate, I thought about revision 1, the real number, $312,000, and revision 3, the field number, $187,000. The word accurate did a lot of work in this house, and then I thought about the text message. Don't use work email. There was a reason compliance documentation had to go through the firm's internal system. Not just policy, liability. If Daniel had prepared a disclosure document in a professional capacity, even informally, even for family, and that document turned out to be materially false, the question of whether he'd done it as a private individual or as a credentialed compliance officer mattered enormously. It was the difference between a personal mistake and a professional violation. The kind that ends careers. The kind that gets reported to licensing boards. He'd kept it off work email because he understood that distinction precisely, which meant he'd known from the beginning that what he was doing had a name. That night, Daniel came home at the usual time, made dinner, asked about my day. I told him it was quiet. We ate at the table where I'd sat that morning with his folder in front of me, and he talked about a regulatory update his firm was tracking, something about the new IDFPR filing requirements rolling out in Q1. I listened. I nodded in the right places, and I thought about one thing I still didn't have. The original document, not the printout, not the photocopy, the actual file. The one whose metadata would show me not just when it was modified, but every version, every change, and whether the creation date had been touched. That file was somewhere. Either on Daniel's work system, where he'd been careful not to put it, or on a personal device, or on Kirsten's. And Kirsten, whatever else she was, had never been careful about her laptop. I knew that because 3 months earlier, I'd helped her recover a lost document on it. I knew her password. I hadn't needed to use it for anything until now. At this point, I knew what the numbers meant. I knew what the timestamp discrepancy suggested, but I still had no direct proof that Daniel had backdated anything himself, only that the dates didn't add up. In part 3, I found the original file on Kirsten's laptop, and the revision history inside it showed me something I hadn't expected. Not just what Daniel had changed, but that he had changed field 7, the revenue figure, 3 separate times, and that between his second change and his third, the document sat untouched for 19 minutes. 19 minutes before he saved the final number. Subscribe to follow this story. And tell me in the comments, what do you think happened in those 19 minutes? Kirsten's laptop was a Dell, 4 years old, running Windows 10 with automatic updates she'd been ignoring since spring. I knew this because I'd sat at her kitchen table with it in August, recovering a lease agreement she'd accidentally saved over. She'd watched me work and said she didn't understand computers the way I did, which wasn't exactly true. She understood them fine. She just preferred not to. She gave me her password that afternoon without hesitating. Callaway 1963, her maiden name, her birth year, she hadn't changed it since. I drove to her house on a Thursday morning while Daniel was at work. I told her I was in the neighborhood. I wanted coffee. She seemed pleased, put the kettle on, asked about Daniel. "He's good," I said. "Busy with a big filing quarter." She nodded. I sat at her kitchen table and watched her move around the counter, unhurried. Easy, and I thought about what I was about to do and decided I could live with it. After 20 minutes, she went upstairs to find a cardigan she'd mentioned. Her laptop was open on the counter. I had the file name from the folder printout. KCM Disclosure FY Annual V3 Final. DocX. I typed it into her search bar. It found it in 11 seconds. Inside a folder labeled Filings, Daniel. I opened it. The file was 43 pages, the full disclosure package, not just the summary pages I'd photographed from Daniel's folder. I didn't read it. I went straight to the revision history. In Microsoft Word, revision history lives under File, Info, Version History. It logs every save, every author, every timestamp. It's designed for collaborative documents so teams can see who changed what and when. It's also, it turns out, a precise record of every moment someone had second thoughts. The revision history for KCM Disclosure FY Annual V3 Final. DocX showed 14 saves across 3 sessions. The first session was dated July 18th. 8 saves. Author listed, D. Reeves. The document at that point was structurally complete. I could see from the version snapshots that all 43 pages were populated. Every field is filled, every figure entered. In that July 18th session, Field 7, gross annual revenue, read $312,000. That was the real number. The one from Revision 1 in Daniel's folder. The second session was dated August 4th. 3 saves. Author, D. Reeves. In this session, Field 7 was changed for the first time. $312,000 became $241,000. Still above the $200,000 Tier 1 audit threshold. Still in a territory that would trigger inspections. The save timestamp was 7:14 p.m. The third session was on September 2nd. This was the one I'd been looking for. 3 saves. Author, D. Reeves. The first save of that session was at 8:31 p.m. Field 7 had been changed again. $241,000 became $210,000. Still above $200,000. Still not enough. The second save was at 8:44 p.m. Field 7, $187,000. Below the threshold, below the audit line, the figure that was ultimately submitted to the state. I looked at the timestamp on that second save, 8:44 p.m. Then I looked at the timestamp on the save before it, 8:31 p.m., 13 minutes between them. And then I looked at the third and final save of the session, 8:50 p.m., 6 minutes after the $187,000 entry. That save changed nothing in Field 7. What it changed was the document's creation metadata, resetting the created property to July 18th, to match the date of the first session. The last thing Daniel did before he closed the file on September 2nd was to make it look like the document had never been touched after July. I heard Kirsten's footsteps at the top of the stairs. I closed the file, went back to the browser. She came in, pulling a gray cardigan over her shoulders, and sat across from me with her coffee. We talked for another 30 minutes. She asked if Daniel seemed stressed lately. A little, I said. Filing season. She nodded like that explained something. I drove home. I want to tell you about those 19 minutes now because I've thought about them more than anything else in this entire story. The revision history showed me the sequence clearly. At 8:31 p.m. on September 2nd, Daniel changed the revenue figure to $210,000. Still above the audit threshold, still not what Kirsten needed. At 8:44 p.m., 13 minutes later, he changed it to $187,000. But the document wasn't saved again until 8:50 p.m. 6 minutes after the final figure was entered, the file sat open and unsaved. For 19 minutes, the document remained open while Daniel changed the number twice and saved nothing final. 19 minutes between the first adjustment and the final commit. long enough to correct a mistake, long enough to close the file, long enough to decide exactly what kind of man he was going to be. He could have. No one with Daniel's training could have mistaken what that number represented. He waited 6 minutes, and then he chose. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and wrote out everything I had in order: the text message, the folder, the 3 revision figures, the timestamp sequence, the threshold table. The metadata was reset. The revision history has his name on every save. I looked at the list for a long time. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom. Not a fact, a question. What exactly does a credentialed compliance officer's name on a fraudulent disclosure filing mean for his professional license? I underlined it, because that was the question Daniel hadn't fully thought through when he agreed to help Kirsten. He'd kept it off the work email. He'd reset the metadata. He'd been careful in all the ways that kept this invisible as long as no one looked. But he'd left his name on every page. Prepared by D. Reeves Compliance Review, not as a favor, not as a husband helping the family with paperwork, as a credentialed professional, which meant the IDFPR, the same body Kirsten had filed with, had jurisdiction over him directly. His license sat with them, and I now had a revision history, a threshold calculation, a timestamp discrepancy, and 14 saves with his name attached. I knew, sitting at that table, exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to call Kirsten. I was going to request a consultation with a regulatory attorney, and I was going to bring my notebook, my photographs, and a USB drive with one file on it. KCM Disclosure FY Annual V3 Final. DocX pulled from Kirsten's laptop, with its revision history intact. Before I tell you what the attorney said and what she found in the filing that I hadn't yet noticed, I want to ask you something. Daniel left his name on every page. Do you think he believed no one would ever look? Or do you think somewhere in those 19 minutes, part of him understood exactly where this ended? Tell me in the comments. In Part 4, the attorney found something inside the document's metadata that changed the nature of the exposure entirely, and showed that Revision 3 hadn't been the first false filing Daniel had touched for Kirsten. The attorney's name was Margaret Solis. A colleague had mentioned her once, offhandedly, something about a landlord dispute, and I'd written her name in my phone the way you write things you don't expect to need. I called her on a Monday morning from my car, parked 2 blocks from my office. I told her I had a regulatory documentation question, that it involved a compliance professional and a state filing. I needed to understand the exposure before I decided what to do with what I had. She said she could see me on Thursday at 1. I said that was fine. I didn't tell Daniel I was going. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop. Small, precise, the kind of space that communicates competence without announcing it. She was in her mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and took notes on a narrow legal pad with a pen she kept clicking closed between points. I laid everything out in the order I'd assembled it: the text message, the physical folder and its paperless contradiction, the 3 revision figures, the IDFPR threshold table, the footer timestamp against Daniel's verbal account. The portal's creation date is against the document's modification date. The revision history, 14 saves, 3 sessions, and his name on all of them. And the 19 minutes. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You copied the file?" "Yes, USB drive." She held out her hand. She opened the file on her own laptop and went directly to the revision history the same way I had. She moved through it methodically. Session 1, Session 2, Session 3. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she stopped, scrolled back. I looked at something in the July 18th session that I hadn't examined carefully. Who set up the document structure? She asked. I assumed Daniel. She turned the laptop to face me. She was pointing at the document properties panel, not the revision history, the field directly above it. Template origin, KCM base template FY. .x template last modified. March 11th template author, D. Reeves March 11th. 6 months before the September filing. This document was built on a template, she said. Daniel created the template in March, which means he wasn't brought in to clean up an existing filing. He built the architecture from the beginning. Is that significant? She set her pen down. It's significant because template creation is a deliberate act. You don't build a structured disclosure template as a casual favor. You build one when you intend to use it repeatedly. More than once. You're saying there are other filings. I'm saying the template exists for a reason, and I'd want to know whether KCM Holdings filed anything else with the IDFPR in the past 2 years, and whether any of those filings share this document structure. She pulled up the IDFPR Public Records portal while I was still sitting there. KCM Holdings had filed 3 documents in the past 24 months. The annual disclosure we already had was on September 9th. A license renewal was filed on April 3rd, and a bond certification filed on March 19th. March 19th. 8 days after Daniel created the template. Margaret cross-referenced the bond certification against the state's bonding requirement schedule for Tier 2 property management companies. She found it in 4 minutes. Illinois requires Tier 2 property management companies, those below the $200,000 revenue threshold, to carry a surety bond of $25,000. Tier 1 companies above the threshold are required to carry $75,000. KCM Holdings bond certification, filed March 19th, listed a $25,000 bond. The bond that matched the Tier 2 requirement. The tier Kirsten had not yet formally established in March because the annual revenue disclosure that would place her in Tier 2 wasn't filed until September. She filed for the lower bond requirement, I said, 6 months before she filed the revenue numbers that would justify it. Margaret looked at me over her reading glasses, which means either she anticipated the revenue figure would come in below the threshold on its own, or she already knew what the annual disclosure was going to say. In March, when Daniel had built the template, I thought about the August 4th session in the revision history. Daniel's first attempt to reduce the revenue figure was from $312,000 to $241,000. Still above threshold. Still not low enough. That session was at 7:14 p.m. on a weeknight. I thought about what that meant. He hadn't been asked to fix a number once. He'd been working toward a specific destination, below $200,000, across multiple sessions and multiple months. Because the bond certification filed in March had already committed Kirsten to a Tier 2 position she hadn't yet formally earned. The revenue number didn't just need to be lower, it needed to land below $200,000 specifically, or the March bond certification would become a false instrument retroactively. A document claiming an entitlement KCM Holdings didn't qualify for. The revision history rearranged itself into something much harder to dismiss. The August 4th attempt wasn't careless. It was a calculation that came up short. The September 2nd session, $210,000, then $187,000, then 19 minutes, then save, was the third attempt to close an equation that had been opened in March. Margaret made notes for another 10 minutes while I sat quietly. Then she looked up. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. It was a precise question, not sympathetic, not leading, just exactly. I'd been thinking about it since the kitchen table. Since the night I'd written the list and underlined the question about Daniel's license. "I want it documented," I said, formally, "before he realizes what I have." She nodded slowly. "You have grounds to file an anonymous complaint with the IDFPR against KCM Holdings for material misrepresentation across at least 2 filings. That triggers a mandatory review. They'll pull the documents themselves. And Daniel?" She set her pen down again. "If the IDFPR review surfaces the bond certification issue and the revenue discrepancy, they'll look at the preparer of record on the annual disclosure. His name is on the document as a compliance professional. That carries its own track. The IDFPR can refer to its licensing board directly." "His employer," I said. "Would they be notified?" "If his license is flagged, his employer would likely learn of it through the licensing board's public record update." "Yes." I thought about Daniel at dinner, talking about Q1 filing requirements. The careful, empty language. The way he described his work for 4 years was as something dull and procedural and sealed off from everything else. "What do I need to do first?" I asked. She turned a fresh page on her legal pad. "You give me the USB drive. I make certified copies, logged with today's date and my bar number so the chain of custody is clean. You go home. You don't change your behavior. You don't confront him and you don't contact Kirsten. You let me file the complaint and you wait." "How long?" "IDFPR complaint reviews run 4 to 8 weeks for an initial response. If they flag it for investigation, it accelerates." She held out her hand for the drive. I gave it to her. I drove home in the early afternoon through October light that had gone thin and pale. And I thought about one specific thing Margaret had said. "You don't change your behavior." That was the instruction I understood most completely, because I had not been changing my behavior for 3 weeks already. Since that night, I'd read the text message and set the phone back face down on the nightstand and gone to bed. Daniel had come home every evening to a version of our life that looked exactly like it had before. Dinner, conversation, the comfortable rhythms of a shared household. He had no reason to believe anything had shifted. He did not know about the folder of photographs. He did not know I had been to Kirsten's laptop. He did not know about Margaret Soley's, or the USB drive, or the certified copies now sitting in a locked file in a Loop office building with today's date on them. He did not know that the document he had spent 3 sessions and 19 minutes of his life carefully constructing was no longer only on Kirsten's desktop. That evening, he came home and made pasta, and told me about a colleague who'd misread a disclosure window and caused a minor internal review. "The thing about compliance," he said, setting a bowl in front of me, "is that the mistakes that matter are always the ones that seemed small at the time." I looked at him. "I believe that," I said. He sat down across from me and picked up his fork. And I understood for the first time since this started that I didn't need to be angry. I had the revision history. I had the template origin date. I had the bond certification misfiling. I had Margaret's certified copies and a formal complaint that was going to move through a regulatory body, whether Daniel knew about it or not. The process had its own momentum now. All I had to do was not change my behavior. In Part 5, the IDFPR response arrived, and it contained something Margaret hadn't predicted. Not a routine inquiry, a preservation notice requiring Daniel's employer to produce every external compliance document he had touched in the previous 12 months. Tell me in the comments, at what point do you think Daniel first understood what was coming? And was there a moment when you thought he could have stopped it? Part 5 is the final part of this story. Subscribe so you don't miss it. 31 days after Margaret filed the complaint, the IDFPR answered. She called me at 9:14 a.m. I was at my desk. I stepped into the hallway and stood near the window at the end of the corridor where no one could hear me. She read it to me in full. It was 11 sentences. Formal, measured, bureaucratic in the specific way of documents that carry significant weight while appearing not to. The agency had opened a formal compliance review of KCM Holdings following a third-party disclosure. As part of that review, it had identified the preparer of record on the FY annual disclosure filing, listed as D. Reeves, Compliance Review, and determined that the filing raised questions of professional conduct warranting referral. The referral had gone to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulations Professional Standards Division, and a preservation notice had been issued to Daniel's employer requiring production of all external compliance engagements, informal advisory work, and document preparation activities attributed to Daniel Reeves in the preceding 12 months. Margaret paused when she finished reading. "That's faster than I expected," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means the bond certification issue was visible enough that they connected it without us having to walk them through it. They did that analysis themselves." I looked out the window at the street 11 floors below. When does his employer receive the notice? They've already received it. Preservation notices are served simultaneously with the referral. I thanked her and went back to my desk. I sat down and opened the document I'd been working on before she called. I finished it. Then I went to lunch. Daniel found out on a Friday, not from me, from his firm's general counsel, who called him into a conference room at 2 p.m. and showed him the preservation notice. I know the timeline because he told me himself that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on. He'd come home at 4:30, an hour and a half early. He sat down. He didn't make dinner, didn't ask about my day. He set his keys on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "The IDFPR sent a preservation notice to the firm." I set down what I was holding. About KCM. It wasn't a question, but I let the silence hold its shape and waited for him to fill it. "They're asking for every external document I prepared in the last 12 months. He looked up at me. "Claire, did you?" He stopped. He looked at my face, and I watched him understand, not in a single moment, in the way a structure shifts, not collapsing, just settling. Everything is moving slightly into a new configuration that can't go back. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've weeks." He was quiet for a long time. "The folder?" "Yes." "And Kirsten's laptop?" "Yes." He put both hands flat on the table. He didn't argue, didn't perform confusion or denial. He was a man who worked in compliance. He understood, probably better than anyone, exactly what a preservation notice meant and exactly what the revision history would show anyone who looked at it carefully. He sat with the precise shape of what he had done. "I want to tell you why," he said finally. "I know why," I said. He looked at me. "She asked you, you thought it was small enough to manage, and then the bond certification made it load-bearing, and by August you were solving for number you'd already committed to in March." His jaw moved slightly. "I didn't plan it that way from the beginning." "I know you didn't. The bond filing was supposed to be..." "Daniel." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to explain the sequence," I said. "I understand the sequence." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly past the window. "What happens now?" he asked. "The IDFPR completes its review. The Professional Standards Division decides whether to refer your license for disciplinary action. Your firm decides what to do with the results of the preservation notice. And us." I looked at him for a moment. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's honest." He nodded slowly. It was the first conversation we'd ever had that contained nothing false. What happened after that moved the way institutional processes move. Not dramatically, but with a wait that doesn't stop once it starts. The firm placed Daniel on administrative leave within 2 weeks of receiving the preservation notice. Their internal review found no other external engagements of the same kind. The KCM work appeared to be isolated, but the nature of the violation was significant enough that leave was mandatory pending the IDFPR outcome. Kirsten received her own notice 6 days after Daniel's firm received theirs. KCM Holdings was required to produce original financial records for an audit. The actual revenue figures, unrevised, for the filing year in question. She called me the evening she received it. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to have that conversation. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Her message was 40 seconds long. She said she didn't know how this had started. She said she needed me to know she hadn't wanted it to go this far. I listened to it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand, the same motion, and I went to sleep. The IDFPR's formal determination came 11 weeks after the complaint was filed. KCM Holdings' license was suspended pending a corrected filing and payment of an administrative penalty. The surety bond was voided and reissued at the Tier 1 rate, $75,000, retroactive to the March certification date. Daniel's license referral resulted in a formal reprimand entered into the IDFPR's public professional record and 2 years of supervised compliance practice, meaning every filing he prepared would require a countersignature from a licensed supervisor. His firm did not extend his employment past the leave period. Margaret called me when the determinations were published. She read both to me the same way she'd read the preservation notice, measured, complete, without editorializing. When she finished, she said, "That's a reasonable outcome given the evidence. I want to tell you the last thing, not the legal outcome, not Kirsten's corrected filing or Daniel's job search or the careful, difficult conversations that followed over months. The last thing is this. 3 weeks after the determination was published, I was sorting through the filing cabinet in the home office, clearing it out, a practical task and nothing more, and I found something tucked behind the second drawer. A notepad, 3 pages of Daniel's handwriting, dates, figures, threshold calculations, working notes from the August sessions I could tell from the numbers. The intermediate figures he'd tried and abandoned, $241,000, $218,000, $203,000. Each one crossed out, and at the bottom of the 3rd page, below the final figure, $187,000 circled, is a single line in different ink. Written later, I thought, or at least separately. It said, "This is the last time." I stood in the home office for a long time, holding 3 pages of notebook paper. Then I put them back where I found them. I closed the drawer. I don't know if he wrote that line before he saved the file or after. I don't know if he meant it as a resolution or a justification or something he needed to believe in the moment to close the laptop and walk away. What I know is that the document's revision history showed he opened the file again 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, to reset the creation date. He kept one promise. The number stayed exactly where he had finally decided it belonged. If you've ever wondered how quietly a life can come apart, subscribe to Sorrow Nest Tales and tell me in the comments, do you think he meant it